Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Welcome.
Hello. Hi.
We are starting now. Let me go ahead and
Rob looks very mysterious right now.
This is what I look like now. It's just my new look.
It's a good look on you.
Thank you.
Welcome to JS.Interactive. Okay, sorry. Okay, welcome to JS.Interactive. Today we have Rob Dodson. Whoa. Welcome to JS.Interactive. Let's just hold on. I'm having some technical difficulties. Okay, there we go. Sorry, guys. All right, can everybody see my screen, hopefully?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Welcome to JS.Interactive. Today we have Rob Dodson, Ben Lesh, Dan Abramov, Evan Yu, Matthew Beale, and Misko Hevery joining us. For those of you who don't know, JS.Interactive is a part of This.media, so you can go to this.co and check out a bunch of different exciting things we have going on. About a month ago, we did This.JavaScript, where we had these 6 gentlemen talk about the state, or basically state of their different frameworks and libraries. We have This.JavaScript happening on April 21st and August 18th, so register for those. These types of events will happen quarterly. Next quarter, we will have Adi Osmani from the Chrome team speaking, as well as Sean Larkin from Webpack and a few other people. Angular Cruise is coming up. This is something I'm very excited about, May 29th. Check out ngcruise.com if you want to go on a cruise to the Caribbean with us and a bunch of really awesome speakers. So today with JS.Interactive, this is going to be an open session. So for this, feel free to, from an audience, feel free to go ahead and ask questions as you like in the live chat. We're happy to answer all of them. We also have collected a few questions from just the general JavaScript community, which we will be going ahead and asking. I will be one of your panel moderators. My name's Tracy. You can follow me on Twitter at LadyLeet. And then we also have Jay, who is a panel moderator. Jay, did you want to go ahead and quickly introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm obviously Jay. I'm a software engineer at Netflix, and I'll just be asking some questions and doing some basic moderation today. You can find me on Twitter at _J Phelps. Nice,
very cool. So I'll go ahead and get started with a few questions. We had actually quite a few, but I think I'll just pose a question for everybody in the audience. What framework or its feature inspired you guys to do what you did? And how did it, this is kind of a strange question, how did that express itself in what you completed? That was a pretty bad question. Can I change it? that was like the worst. I just like read a community question and it sucked. Okay, where do you think frameworks can collaborate in 2017? That's a better one.
I'm going to cheat in order and answer the first one.
Yeah, answer the
because
first one.
I think it actually does. I don't know. For me, I don't know. I like thinking about it a little bit. I know that for me, like when I started off working with JavaScript, when I was an early developer looking around at like what the tools were out there that I wanted to work with, I was coming from a background where I had written a bunch of PHP and then done a bunch of Ruby and was really inspired, at the early time of Rails, of being inspired by what was going on there, and metaprogramming and really trying to grasp object-oriented programming for the first time in my career. It was really exciting. And I was looking around in the browser for tools that would provide the same kind of surface that I could kind of riff on. And the thing that ended up attracting me the most was definitely MooTools. MooTools felt like it had like a robust like object and class system, and it had like abstractions that you could use to build complex things in the browser. And I feel like there was like this moment when MooTools had this great promise for what we could do in the browser, but maybe the performance wasn't there yet, and the browser environment really wasn't ready for any of that. And instead, jQuery went out, and we kind of went on this like, these like 5 years, 10 years in the woods wandering, working with kind of messy plugin APIs in the browser. And the thing that initially attracted me to Ember was looking at it and seeing Sprout Core had a lot of similar things, where it had a really robust kind of object system. And you could see that there are these basic abstractions that you could use to build really complex things in the browser. So I'm excited that that Ember and of course all these other frameworks are also allowing us to do that again and kind of bring back that that excitement that I originally had when I worked with MooTools. So I think that's like a common ground that most frameworks have at this point, where few of us are working by patching things onto random arbitrary, jQuery.event.special.handler paths. Instead, we're building real composable primitives. So that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, I think I have maybe a similar experience. So years ago, I was working for a pretty big, like giant, like enterprise type company, and we were trying to build. We had been building a component library. And what we had been building at that time were jQuery plugins, and people were happy about that. They really liked that. But like there were some folks who were a little unfamiliar with sort of the setup of like loading in the script tags. We were also using like require.js and things like that. So they were like a little confused by the async loading of script. Didn't quite know that like you can't just go poke around in the internals of a jQuery plugin after it has sort of like inflated itself, right? And so they would just like rip things out and be like, it broke, what's up? And so at that time, we were like, we should really take another stab at this and try and use a more modern component building library. And so we were looking at a few different things. We were looking at Knockout. We were looking at Angular 1. We were looking, there was like a third one. I can't quite remember off the top of my head that we were looking at. But at the same time, I started to get interested in web components, because I was like, it'd be really cool if we could build something. And then within the company, there were people who were really into Knockout. There were people who were really into Angular. And so it's like, oh, it'd be really neat if we could build one thing that both of those teams could use. And so web components at the time, this was years ago, so they were like just being spec'd out, like nobody had shipped anything yet. But I was looking at it, and I was writing about it a lot at the time, because I was like, I'd love for this to be the thing. So we just write the component once in very primitive JavaScript, and then sort of hand it out to those teams, and they could data bind to it or do whatever they wanted. And so that's really what got me into like web components and things like that. And then eventually Polymer, where it is today.
I actually came at this from a totally different angle, where it was more like, well, here's this interesting tool I use all the time. How does it work? And then you go and you look at the source code and you're like, well, that's interesting. How does that work? And then eventually you gain enough knowledge where you're like, well, maybe I can try to implement one of these myself. And at one point I had implemented, I was like, I'm going to make my own frameworky thing. And it ended up being like this really crappy, buggy version of Angular 1, really, is what I ended up writing. And I was like, this is silly. I'll just contribute to Angular. So that's like my first open source stuff, was contributing to Angular.
Thank you for the contribution, sir.
Oh, I think my first PR was rejected, actually. But yeah, and then as far as Rx goes, I had a lot of passion around it, and I was asked to work on it. And I told the people that asked me to work on it that I was wholly unqualified to work on it. But I'm glad that I did. But yeah, for me, it was mostly, rather than trying to fulfill some need, like I came at it from a different angle, where I was more curious about how things worked, and then I wanted to improve them. So digging into jQuery source was a big thing. Digging into Angular source was a big thing, and I learned a lot of interesting stuff when I was doing it.
Any other comments?
Sure, I'll give you my story. So I actually worked at Adobe on, there's a separate project, but essentially Adobe, we were building apps using the Flex framework from ActionScript. So Angular 1, in a lot of ways, if you squint hard enough, is kind of the whole Flex ActionScript world brought to the browser. People are shaking their heads, yes, no.
Dan or Evan, do you guys want to add anything to that?
Sure, yeah. So I'm having a code today, so my voice might sound really weird, but yeah, when I started working on Vue, I kind of like, it's similar to how Ben started. Like I was just curious, because we were using Angular 1 in some of the projects, and I was just really curious how it worked under the hood. So I just poked and found out it used dirty checking. And I was like, is there another way to do this? And that's when I experimented with the ES5 getters and setters stuff. And then I built my own crappy version of Angular 1. And then slowly shaped it into something that's more usable. But a big difference is the reason I decided to continue to work on it was that when I was like using Angular 1, learning Angular 1 and learning Ember, obviously, when I was learning these heavier frameworks, because I didn't come from a enterprise application background, for me, it was like a total JS noob going into these frameworks. It was a pretty difficult experience. And I just felt there was a disconnection for someone with just basic understanding of HTML, CSS, JavaScript, jumping into a very, these frameworks that brings all these enterprise application structures and design patterns into the browser world. It was not easy. So I wanted to, but I see a lot of the benefits in there. What I wanted to do is to extract the parts that are quintessential to, no matter how complex your app is, you probably you will always benefit from things like data binding or declarative rendering. I wanted to extract these things and expose them in a package that doesn't come with these additional concepts, so people have an easier time to jump into these and serve as a gateway drug for them to, comprehend these more complex concepts later. So it's kind of like you introduce them a block, and then you introduce them to how to put these blocks together instead of throwing all the blocks to them at once. So that was the primary reason I started working on Vue, and I think so far it's been, I think it's been attracting a certain population of devs who've been, they've just sort of intimidated by more full solution frameworks, but I think if you somehow brought them into this world of not being afraid of jumping into these things, I think that's one of the things I think you did that was probably unique to it. Yeah.
So the question is how I kind of like got started with React. And I think, I mean, I wasn't there when React came out, right? Because I joined React team much later. But the way it worked for us is that I didn't really have a web background. So I just joined the company at the time, and we were building an iPad app. And then the directive came that we should make everything work for the web. And I was like, how the hell do you create a web app? And so at the time, there was Angular and Backbone, and we went with Backbone because it seemed simpler, and we just didn't have time to like dive into how Angular works. And so we started building this really complicated UI in Backbone that, so the app was like an editor for rich media posts where you can drag and drop image galleries, like create different effects and so on. And so there was a lot of dynamic stuff that was kind of hard to express in Backbone because Backbone views don't really have any like explicit composition model. And so we had a lot of this imperative code. And even at the time, so I had some knowledge about functional programming from earlier, like from when I was just learning programming, but I couldn't apply it anywhere. And I kind of tried to structure my imperative code in a way where I try to derive all the view from some data and like have a single function that updates the view according to the current data. And when React came out, I first dismissed it, like the JSX thing was really weird, and I thought it was stupid. But in a couple of months, my colleague persuaded me to give it another try. And we built a small button component, a like button basically, in our app with it. And it was really nice to like write code that declaratively expresses how the UI is supposed to look like. And gradually, we just started rewriting. As we ship more features, we started rewriting all the components in React up higher and higher up the tree until the whole app was basically a React component. And this is how I got started with React. And I really liked it at the time. But I also started experimenting with Webpack because it was too large. We wanted some code splitting, and Webpack looked pretty cool. And Pete Hunter wrote nice things about it. And I saw this feature called hot module replacement, which lets you edit files on the fly. And I thought, hey, this is like a perfect combo, because you can edit something on the fly with Webpack, and Webpack is going to load the new version of the module. But then you have this declarative rendering system that can actually like update things, and it doesn't lose its state and so on. And so I just hacked them together with the React Loader. And that was my first like big project in React ecosystem. And I think a lot of people kind of assume that I know React pretty well. I mean, by this point, I probably do. But at the time, there was a lot of, I published a lot of React modules and stuff, not because I know it really well, but because I was like an early adopter. And I just, like, the component doesn't exist, so I have to create it. So that's why there's a lot of packages. And actually, like, some of my code is pretty lame, but people still use it. So that's how I got started with React, I guess.
And for those watching, sorry, it looks like we've had someone in the chat who's running a bot that's posting spam.
I'm deleting. I'm deleting. There
Yeah.
we go. Okay. Jay, do you want to ask a few questions? I know we have a few questions in the audience. But
Did Matt have a chance to? Matthew, did you have a chance? You did. Okay.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so we had a couple of questions from the audience already. One of them Ben answered on the chat, but I want to discuss it, on the video itself. Alexander asks Ben Lesh whether RxJS is more popular than Angular, which may have been a troll question. But
of course it is. Of course it is. Well, it's a joke from the last one we had. I showed the graph that showed that RxJS is more popular on NPM than Angular, which of course is because RxJS is Angular's only dependency. So
maybe we should make the Rx an optional dependency.
Oh, so mean.
So we've got I've got another question for Dan Abramov from Gokul. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, but he asked, "Hi Dan, I'm interested to know how Fiber can return multiple tags from render of a component, unlike the current React. Do you guys currently wrap those tags or something else?"
No, it's just, I mean, it's not visible on the DOM level. Like in the DOM level, you just see two things and they're just flat. We don't wrap them in anything. And it's just like you return something in React and React just figures out how to flatten it, I guess. Mm-hmm. So the problem is not that it's like hard. It was just hard to do without current implementation. So that's why we waited for Fiber, because our current implementation kind of relied in a lot of ways on there being one-to-one correspondence between the rendered node and the component. But the Fiber implementation doesn't care. Like, it has first-class support for that.
Yeah, that makes sense. We've got another question by Xavier. He asks this question for everyone, actually. Why not join together? Why not join all together to create a single framework? One framework, basically, to rule them all. Well,
too many cooks in the kitchen.
Just put them all together like Voltron.
I think that preassumes that there is one kind of a problem out there, right? If there was one kind of a problem out there, having one kind of a framework would probably make a lot of sense. Because that's not the case, right? And different people have different problem spaces that they go after. It makes sense to have different kinds of frameworks. So for example, Angular, we really are focusing on making sure that we have an end-to-end solution. So everything from, obviously, everybody has data binding, right? It's like the thing you have to have. But then we want to go further and say, like, well, how do you bring large teams of people together? So we make TypeScript first-class citizens so people can cooperate. The question is then, well, how do you bring it to a lot of different people in different languages? So we have to make sure that internationalization, localization, and translations is all part of the system. Then, how do you make apps that are nicely animated? And so we make sure that animations is all part of it, right? And so when you look at it as a holistic point of view, you get a different answer than if you look at it as, I just want to have a really good way of updating the DOM. Those two requirements end up with two different kinds of answers. And I think this is the reason why we have lots of different frameworks. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing, right? Because that means that people have choices. I know a lot of people think that it would be nice if choices were made for them, but I think choices are a good thing because you can look around and you can kind of figure out and you learn. And the frameworks actually learn a lot from each other. I know we look a lot at other frameworks, how they do things, and a lot of the stuff does percolate eventually back into Angular and how we do rendering or how we do many things. And I know we have influenced others. Just to kind of point out, like I know that dependency injection was kind of new to Angular, and now Ember is all proud to have dependency injection as well. And I'd like to say that it's probably because of us.
So
Oh, go ahead, Ben.
I was going to say that I think the one framework to rule them all is supposed to be the platform, which, I mean, we're always going to have some abstractions on top of the platform because the platform is always going to have some deficiency compared to what we need. But I think the real difficulty is right now there's a group of people developing the platform, and that includes, there's one group of people working on the JavaScript spec, there's one group of people working on the DOM spec, there's different groups of people working on browser implementations and runtimes and these things, and it's kind of hard to get consensus among all of these people, especially when they all have very strong opinions about frameworks and how much code we're shipping to the browser versus how much they should be shipping to the browser. Ideally what would happen is all of these frameworks that clearly represent good ideas that people need, because there's so many people that use them, like the better ideas from those would start landing in browsers natively, as opposed to features that are similar but different enough that it's not exactly what people have been wanting out of these frameworks. So like if we could just get more and more features into the platform so they're already on your machine, so we don't have to ship them to your machine, the frameworks could get smaller and leaner and slightly more focused on specific needs that the platform doesn't meet. And then ideally one day the platform does everything that everyone needs, and all the people you're looking at here get to move on to other things, or are sunsetted. They'll ship poor Dan Abramov off because there won't be anything left. Like Redux will just be in the browser. But it's probably not true. But that's the idea, is to get everything into the platform.
Yeah. So to piggyback on that a little bit, I think there are definitely places where instead of having one Uber framework, you have pieces that get added to the platform that then the frameworks can share. I think the effort right now on at least the browser vendor side is to ship more low-level primitives, so things like service worker, web components, and things like that, or the pieces that roll up into web components. The idea being that rather than try and have a high-level abstraction that every framework would have to use, you can give folks primitives that they can then build libraries on top of, and then when they do that, it then shows the browser makers, okay, here's where the community is heading. And then, as Ben was saying, here's the stuff that we should be implementing. I think the difficulty today is that the standards process and how browser makers decide what they're going to implement is pretty opaque. And it feels I think to most people, it probably feels like a club that they're not a part of. And I think that is probably something that really needs to change. And it's difficult because I'm also not a expert in web standards stuff, and so I don't really know the best way to change that. I do like that some web standards stuff is now being moved over to GitHub instead of mailing lists. I think that makes it for a lot of web developers a little bit more accessible. So being able to go to the W3C GitHub or something like that and just comment on an issue or follow an issue helps a lot. But I definitely think there's more that could be done there, and that's feedback that I think all the browser folks should really pause and think about. How do we make sure that we're listening to people better and not, as Ben said, implementing something that's kind of like what they wanted but not quite.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the platform, at least some of the more vocal people on the platform side, have been they frequently complain about the size of the framework additions and things that people are shipping to the browser, or maybe even the what comes with bundled code. And I feel like that if like people that are working on the platform are in a key position to ship features that would drastically reduce the code every framework would have to ship to the browser, right? Like they could implement things just that would then already exist in the browser that would allow frameworks to no longer have to do certain things, bundle or include certain primitives or whatever. And if we could get everybody to work together on that, it would be amazing, frankly.
Yeah, I wanted to. Sorry, I just wanted to raise one thing that Rob had mentioned about the standards group being interested in adding composable primitives, and I think as a rule that is, as like a general rule, that is a direction that they're heading. But there are some things like decorators where you hear through the grapevine of pushback on the idea that that features should be added to the platform itself to benefit frameworks. Basically, decorators are a thing that if you're building an app on your own, like if you're an average developer building an app, you're not going to use decorators. But if you,
I think they're useful even on their own. Why would you say?
Well, and I think you and I would probably agree, as like you and I would agree. But I think the conversation in regards to the platform is actually more complicated than that. From us, you're going to hear very much a view that the browser should provide you composable tools, but there also is a very vocal part of the platform that says that no, the platform itself should be totally sufficient in everything. Most of the things that we're doing are not actually relevant for that platform, and that's a really challenging balance and difficult thing to influence when you're, like you said, not part of that club or don't have great visibility into what happens.
So someone from the chat, from the community, named Sem, he asked, should the virtual DOM abstraction actually be added to the platform itself? Some sort of generic virtual DOM?
I think virtual DOM is a hack. Like a lot of people think virtual DOM is some kind of like thing in React. First of all, there's no virtual DOM. So React doesn't really have a concept of virtual DOM internally. There's this thing that we have this concept of elements, which are descriptions of your UI trees. And the thing is that they describe both native UI trees and the composite components. And React wants to have control over how components are interpreted. So and we use the same system on React Native and other platforms like React VR. So in this sense, to like, well, to me, it doesn't make sense to put something like this in the browser. But there are some things that would probably be useful, like maybe, for example, being able to, like some DOM APIs are kind of tricky, like, for example, setting children, where you have these methods like append child and insert before and so on, but no way to just say that here's a new children array and just like, yeah, so this kind of stuff.
These properties at the same time, yeah.
Yeah, so this would make it easier to like remove a bunch of code from the different algorithms that kind of have to work around the low-level DOM APIs. But I think that component implementation is useful in userland.
Can I add some stuff to it? I think in general, it's dangerous. I mean, I understand why people say like, oh, let's just add it to the platform, then everybody can benefit. The trouble is it's kind of dangerous because once you add it to the platform, it's essentially there forever and it cannot be taken out. And the thing is, people's view of how one should build app is constantly changing. And so when you put something in the platform, you're essentially saying, we have thought about it and this is the truth and this will never change, right? And that's problematic. I know, for example, in the past, we were trying to actually bring data binding all the way to the browser. This has since been withdrawn because we realized that I wasn't working on it specifically, but I was helping the person who's putting it in. And the realization we had is that simple things like the order in which the bindings are evaluated actually makes a difference and makes a semantic difference to the application. And so if you cannot even agree on such order, like what makes you think that these kinds of features can be beneficial to everybody? So I've come around, and I've come to the conclusion that really the only kind of stuff that should be added to the platform are the absolute bare necessities that cannot be done in the user space. And if it can be done in a user space, I think it can innovate and move forward at a much quicker pace than what is in the platform. And yes, the side effect of that is that people call the JavaScript fatigue, that the world is constantly changing. But I'd like to encourage people to say that this is a good thing, right? Because that means that we are progressing forward and we're not stagnant. Anyways, that's my little rant.
Yeah, and actually, on the topic of JavaScript fatigue, someone from the audience asked, people talk. They said people talk about JavaScript fatigue with Webpack and isomorphic apps, and GraphQL and Relay and Falcor, etc. How much of this complexity is essential, and how much of it is just accidental? And this question doesn't appear to be directed to some particular person, but
do you mind if I take that? So
sure.
I'm with you. Accidental complexity versus essential complexity, and a lot of it has to do with abstractions, the mental models, how you think about a particular problem. A lot of it is, people start thinking about a problem in a particular way, and then as they build on, their mental space kind of increases, and they kind of move into a different point of view. And some of it has to be like, well, I can move it slightly, but I want to be backwards compatible, and so you end up with the accidental stuff. And this is why I think it's useful when certain tools outlive their lifespan, and then people kind of learn their mental models from those tools, and then go back and say, okay, what could we do with a fresh point of view and a fresh slate, right? And again, if you start putting these mental models into the platform, you will get yourself in a situation where you cannot just start new and reboot the world and point of view.
Mm-hmm.
I would also add that a lot of complexity just comes from people like prematurely abstracting and prematurely adding some stuff that they won't need. This is the kind of mentality that existed in the backend world, where like you're starting a new product and you're reading articles about how to scale 2 million users. Like if that's your problem, that's cool, but it's probably not your problem yet. And I see the same happening in front end, where like people think about GraphQL when they have a very simple kind of a relationship model, and it just doesn't make sense really. And there's also this culture of like reading the blog posts and trying to apply everything they read. But yeah.
Yeah, in regards to adding something like virtual DOM to the API, and what are like the APIs that the browser could have, I think a better example of something that has been proposed is Yehuda proposed like a way to build up the set of changes that you want to apply to the DOM in a web worker, and then ship that over back to the main UI thread. And that's a good example of something that just empowers people to take whatever algorithm they're using and better allocate that work on the user's browser.
Yeah.
So I'd rather see that than any specific virtual implementation. I think the essential versus accidental complexity thing is like reaching for the silver bullet essay. And when he's talking about essential and accidental complexity, really he means all software is accidental complexity. Like the essential complexity is your business problem. Like you have widgets and you need to get them out of your warehouse. And at that level, the web doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter if you're using COBOL. It doesn't matter if you're using Postgres or MySQL. It doesn't matter if you're using Angular or Polymer. That's like none of that stuff is really important. All of that is a set of problems that is created by trying to solve getting widgets out of your factory as quickly as possible. And I think I think all of us probably have that in mind a lot, is like trying to reduce that accidental complexity, reduce that cost to you as someone who's using a framework that you need to deal with like extra levels of abstraction that have a cost.
Okay, so we'll take another question from the audience here. We've got a question. Any plans to adapt WebAssembly in the core of any of these frameworks? It's pretty early for WebAssembly, but have there been any discussions? Any
So
maybe
we looked at it
frames?
a little bit. I'm very, very top level knowledge, and I'm probably guilty of a bunch of things that I'm not going to say is not correct. But my understanding is WebAssembly currently has difficulty talking to DOM, and has difficulty intercepting with code that isn't WebAssembly. And I don't know if that's true or not.
That's mostly true. You can't have opaque references in WebAssembly yet.
Right.
You can call out to JavaScript, but you'd have to. It's basically a proxy.
Right. So that to me, that tells me that it's very difficult to have a hybrid world where like user code is regular JavaScript and then the framework is WebAssembly or something like that. I think it requires a brand new approach of like, okay, let's say everything is a WebAssembly. What would the world look like? Mm-hmm. And that's the exercise that I haven't done yet myself. But
a brand new framework.
Unfortunately, I feel like it would have to be that way.
Well, what about something simpler, like just having certain libraries that are computationally expensive, but that are pure functions. They don't mutate DOM or anything like that.
Sure.
You know, I can see some of these frameworks in the future when WebAssembly support is more prolific.
I agree with you, but like if you look at most applications, right, there isn't really anything computationally expensive per se. It's just a bunch of stuff has to get moved and things have to get updated, and like there isn't any one algorithm that's just computationally expensive, right? If you were doing lots of computing of SHAs or encryption or whatever, like perfect WebAssembly, right? But like getting data from the database to the browser UI and then back to the database, like there isn't any one thing that's computationally expensive. It's just a combination of like I have to wait for this IO to happen over here, and then this thing over here, and then update the DOM, right? And
I'd be a bit curious to see how concurrency libraries could benefit from WebAssembly, like RxJS, for example. You know, I don't really know enough about it to comment intelligently, but I do wonder if WebAssembly could be used to get better actual concurrency out of types like promises and observables and those sorts of things, as opposed to trying to use WebAssembly like in a framework necessarily.
Yeah, I think the thing you want to avoid is like the trap that Cappuccino and Sprout Core 1 fell into, where they were basically layers on top of the web. So you were talking about like taking, well, they were still called components, but you're talking about taking components and Vue objects and composing them together for things. But there was no way for you to really interact with the DOM. Things like CSS were not really a part of the framework proper. You were building at like a totally higher level. And I think some of the React Native work, maybe the React Native on the web stuff that happens, which is definitely not the most conventional path, that gets close to that, where you're like not really supposed to think about the fact that you have the web as a platform. The platform is not important. And I think that's the risk that you don't want to fall into if you start using WebAssembly. I think it's better for, like Ben is suggesting, hotspots that maybe you can find good use for it.
Unless you're making a game, obviously.
Right, sure. I mean, there are obviously other use cases that are totally different than what most of our frameworks are working on, which is like business level problems.
Yeah, if you're making a game, then I think almost everybody's framework here is gonna suck a little bit, because they're not really made for that, right?
Yeah,
that's right.
Not at all. So Dan, we had a question about the status of Fiber, and actually, as a segue to that, has there been any talk about, since Fiber is basically re-implementing its own stack frame, a virtual stack frame, something like WebAssembly in the future might be something to take a look at. Right now, because it doesn't have opaque references to JavaScript objects, it's not possible. But is that something you guys have discussed? Is like mainly for me personally, they didn't ask this, but I'm interested personally. I think even though it's a long way out, it's important that if it's something that might be possible, that they start collaborating now just with the WebAssembly people to make sure that it's going in the direction that's going to actually be usable. Because one of my fears with WebAssembly, I've worked a lot with it myself, and one of the fears is just that it's only going to be used for people who make games, and that's it, because they don't think of they're not hearing from the other use cases, from like the web, the actual normal web use cases. And I think that there are a lot that would be handy.
As far as I know, like I don't know much about WebAssembly, if anything. So what I know is I think there are a few versions, and like the first version was implemented in the browser, but then the latest spec is actually like more powerful or something. Maybe I'm wrong. Like I'm not sure. I was just moving on discussions.
The latest spec is up to date in Chrome and Firefox. They're all up to date. But it's in Canary.
But I know that this is something Sebastian Magboge. So he's like the person with the green leaf avatar, who's on our team, and he's like the person behind Fiber mostly, who led the team. And he was thinking about it, and I know that he experimented with WebAssembly. I'm not sure what are the conclusions, so it's might be better to ask him. For this, what was the first question about Fiber?
The status of Fiber.
Yeah, it's a work in progress. I would say that so we have some major infrastructure kind of things left that we're working on right now. So React on Fiber itself works. We've been using it ourselves for 2 months at Facebook. For our team was opted into it, so nobody else saw it, but our team was dogfooding it internally. And we started switching it on for employees like maybe since a month ago or something. And we are actually running a public test now. So about, I think, like 0.5% or maybe something like this. I'm not sure. But anyway, there's people who get Fiber in production on Facebook right now. So we're testing it. So I'm fairly confident about the DOM part working. I spent the last couple of weeks working on React DevTools and getting to work with Fiber, and also like getting up to date and everything. And then React Native, there is still some ongoing work to integrate it into React Native. And then there's we don't have any server rendering support yet because we don't use it. So it's like one of the last priorities before the release. So we'll likely want to collaborate with someone from the community to. So the part we need to implement, first of all, is reviving the markup. So we currently don't have support in Fiber to boot up from server-rendered markup, which is something we'll need to add. And the other thing is server rendering itself, obviously. So we want to drop the stack that is the old implementation of React completely. And so we'd either have to port server render into Fiber, which we probably won't do because it's synchronous and it like kind of doesn't make sense. And we also want to optimize it more for a specific server use case. And we know that some companies are actually running their own like forks or their own implementations of React server rendering. So we might want to just throw away the old implementation completely and replace it with a faster one. So that's like one of the last blockers. There's still a couple of like add-ons, like perf add-on that we need to make work with Fiber. That's what I'm going to be working on next week. And if you're interested in the progress, there's if you go to React repo to EJS and search for Fiber umbrella, there's a bunch of checkboxes there that we try to check off. So yeah, you can follow the progress there.
So I have a question for Evan of the Vue team. Evan, are you with me?
Yes.
Hey, Evan. So I've been taking a look personally at Vue more lately just because I keep seeing people tweet about it. Like it keeps showing up in my feed, and I just, I've been putting it off, and I finally took a look at it, and I was experimenting with it, and really exciting. And I really like, specifically, there's a third-party add-on for RxJS support, like more robust support, and I think it works really well. One of my immediate questions that I couldn't find anything on was, do you guys have any plans for a more modern syntax, like using ES6 classes or something like that? Because right now it just reminds me of more the backbone age of like how you declare the components.
Right. So the whole idea is, if you only follow the official guide, you'll probably see like we introduced the whole thing with like including Vue with a script tag, and you just use ES5 with like object syntax and all that. And this is somewhat intentional because we want to minimize the cognitive overhead for anyone with, just even the most basic understanding of web technologies to be able to get on board. But once you get past that, if you look at the type of workflow scaffolded with Vue CLI, you'll see that we use Webpack with the Vue single file format, which inside you just use full ES6. ES 2015, and we also have officially maintained, there is a officially maintained transform that can work with both Babel and TypeScript that allows you to write Vue components using a more class-based syntax. But this is opt-in because I've actually explained this a little bit while ago on Reddit, where someone was complaining that Vue doesn't support like declaring a component with just a plain ES6 class. And my opinion there was there is some metadata that you need for declaring a component that is just, you cannot express them elegantly using what ES 2015 class is right now. Like you can't use property initializers. You can't use like static property directly in the declaration. You have to use the static getter, or you have to attach the static property after you have declared the class, or you need a decorator, which is, not there yet. Right. essentially, if you want to support an out-of-the-box, very elegant way of declaring components, you need some feature that's not actually there yet. And this means you will need a build tool chain. You will need like plugins for stage 2 features, which just overall makes the onboarding experience much more complex than it has to be. So the whole idea is for now, like, when the features are actually there, we're definitely going to move and, make the default just leverage all these new features that's coming up. But before the whole platform, before these features that we think we need is universally supported in every browser, we want to keep the onboarding experience minimal because our baseline is the same code should work for every beginner in every browser that we support. So, and we still value that onboarding experience. So that's the primary reason that we don't actually use ES15 as the default. But once we move beyond that, like once you get familiar with all the workflow with transpiling and Webpack bundling and all that, you can completely get a fully ES 2015 or a TypeScript compliant workflow if you want to.
That's great. Good to hear. Thank you, Evan. I do want to actually toss that question over to Matthew as well of the Ember team, because I used Ember for many years, and I have noticed that Ember still hasn't switched to using classes as well. And I actually know why, but I think it's interesting for the audience to hear from the core team about why they haven't done that. And I'd say particularly because Ember's historically been very like early adopters of specification stuff and really been pushing the boundary to the next. Like they were the first that I'm aware of first major framework to support ES6 modules, well before it was finalized. So Matthew, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think the ES modules, we had interesting timing. I mean, obviously, Yehuda is a huge influence on Ember, and he was a huge influence on the modules specification as well. So, he had maybe specialized knowledge that helped guide that process. But it also happened a bit before there was the formal staging process that ECMAScript has today. So ECMAScript has, I think, 4 stages that a feature proposed feature will move through. And around stage 3, I think, is where we usually think today that we would adopt something in Ember, that we would think it's stable enough that the stage 3 is basically like everyone's going to implement it in their browsers, and unless something explodes, it's going to move to stage 4, which is it's just part of the formal spec. So stage 3 is a very secure point to look at something. So we look at features like decorators, as I mentioned before, that are kind of on that cusp where I think they're still stage 2, and it's this dangerous no man's land where it's like the semantics might change, and if they do change, then we might be caught in like an awkward situation where we had to support an old version of decorators for a long time when in fact we want to support only the latest thing. So I think we're very cognizant of that. I definitely agree with a lot of things Evan said about specifically like instance property setters not being a thing that's available. There's some other things that we would like to see in order to do really elegant things with data binding, like private state. If we have private state, then we can take things that are public, and we could use decorators to install getters, kind of in a Ruby-ish style, where you do add a reader or add a writer instead of manually declaring the property. It's yourself. And if we do that, then we can install points of observation for doing change tracking through the system. Not observation, but just change tracking, tag tracking through the system, which is pretty exciting. So there are a lot of things that we have as ideas for what we can do with the object model. But we want to make sure that when we move to it, we have something that is a foundation that we want to move forward with, and that we only get one chance to do this, right? And I think that's the big reason why everyone is pretty cautious with it. You only get one chance to go to ES classes, and you've made a lot of mistakes in the past, and you don't want to make them again making this transition. You just want to make sure you have a clear runway in front of you.
Yeah, indeed. That's a great answer. So I've got a question from the chat. Brewski, which is an amazing username, by the way, I love that username, asks Misko about is the Angular CLI officially official?
I don't know what officially official means. It is developed by our team, by Hans. He sits right behind me. It is something we are focusing on. It is basically owned by us, so I guess in that sense it's official. It will have its release soon, I don't actually know all the details because I am mostly involved in the core of Angular rather than the tooling behind it.
Well, I would say use it. I use it all the time. Yeah, but I think Hans, and you can follow Hans L at work on his Twitter handle and ask him questions about Angular CLI more so. There's also an Angular CLI handle now on Twitter, or Brocco, BROCCO as well, is another person working on the CLI that you can ask questions there. CLIs, Evan, there was a question from the audience of what is the testing story for Vue CLI?
So for right now, if you use the official Webpack templates, the default bundled testing solution is Karma and Mocha. But it's not like we don't really have a official way of saying this is the only way to test Vue components, because overall it's pretty open-ended, and I've seen people using Ava with Vue. There's also people using Jest with Vue. But the team right now is actually evaluating these different solutions and trying to provide a more opinionated, out-of-the-box experience in the CLI templates. And one of the other thing is because Vue 2.0 introduced Virtual DOM, which gives it the ability to just do a bunch of Virtual DOM-based assertions, similar to what Enzyme does for React. So we're probably going to have something similar to Enzyme for Vue pretty soon. But other than that, we are in the process of it. I personally feel like Jest is pretty promising. I've been playing with it, and it's much better than the first time I tried it. So we might see Jest being part of the official Vue CLI pretty soon. Yeah.
And then staying on CLI questions and testing questions, Rob, for Polymer CLI, what kind of testing does Polymer CLI provide out of the box?
So we built a thing called Web Component Tester, which basically lets you write tests that use Mocha, and then it just runs them. It boots up the browser, it creates little iframes, and it registers your components inside those iframes and runs your tests. The main thing there is making sure that because you can only have a custom element, like one custom element registered at a time in the document, like you can't register, my magic button and then try and register it again. It'll throw an error. So the main thing that you get from Web Component Tester is that it's giving you like a sort of clean registry every time, so you can test your custom elements. So yeah, that's what we're working on, or that's what already exists today in Web Component Tester, and it's just like part of Polymer CLI now. I would be interested though, like longer term, to see if there is an opportunity to like consolidate stuff. So I don't know, I've like used Protractor before for Angular, for instance, and it does a similar thing of like booting up your browser for you, and that's nice. And so one thing that I would like is if there's, fewer options, if some of us could collaborate on some of these test tools, I actually think that'd be kind of nice. But yeah, I mean, at the moment we're using Web Component Tester.
Another question is, can you do integration testing of multiple components together in a test?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess you could do that using Web Component Tester. It's basically you'd write a template where you've got those components. So the way it works is you sort of create a template ahead of time of like what you want the DOM to look like. And when it boots up, it grabs the contents of that template, stamps it, and you kind of test whatever you want. So yeah, you could do something where you've got like a few components registered and you just want to see how they like fit together. That should work fine.
Cool, thank you. Then a question for Ben for RxJS. RxJS provides mechanisms for handling AJAX with observables. These APIs don't generally have a framework-specific implementation, so do you see value in having the RxJS library provide a framework-agnostic mechanism for handling common asynchronous mechanisms such as AJAX?
Well, I mean, Rx does ship with an AJAX method. You can do things with AJAX and do things with WebSockets in Rx. It's not particularly well documented. However, Rx has a lot of interop with anything that's promise-based or obviously observable-based, even if it's not necessarily an Rx observable. If it implements symbol observable like most JS or some of these other things, it should just work. It'll work with fetch because fetch is promise-based. Unfortunately, there's no cancellation of promises yet, and even like the proposed fetch cancellation won't really compose very well with Rx, so we would still have to wrap it. But yeah, all of those things should just work with Rx. You shouldn't really have to worry about it as long as you've got a promise-based or observable-based implementation somewhere from anyone's framework.
Cool, thank you. Question for Misko and the Angular team. I know AOT is a really big thing that you guys are all talking about these days. What strategies are you considering for determining what AOT compiler code should be generated?
Strategies for what compiler code should be generated. So we're focusing right now to making the output of the AOT compiler smaller. We kind of went to the absolute extreme. We wanted to make sure we could get the absolute most performance. Turns out that could be done, but it generates a lot of code. And we decided to scale that back a little bit, where we traded very small amount of performance, something like 5%, for a huge gain in size. And the way that we actually do that is that we ship essentially kind of mini interpreter and kind of an intermediary bytecode representation of what has to happen for the UIs to update. The cool thing about this, I like to point out, is that because our UI is completely declarative, we can do these kinds of things under the hoods with, the user sees it as a gaining performance, smaller size, better startup, but it doesn't actually affect the applications in any way. So we're doing a lot of work in this area to make sure that we can ship less code to the browser, and as a consequence, have actually faster first-time render time.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that sounds extremely similar to Ember's path with Glimmer, where we basically generated the output of template compilation was basically a set of JavaScript code that would then be evaluated in the browser. And that was pretty neat. In theory, it was like, great, I have code that I can run that is optimized for a specific scenario. In practice, it was far better for us to adopt a runtime virtual machine that runs on the client side, and then have the templates themselves just become a series of instructions that populate opcodes for the VM. And that,
Go ahead.
yeah, that's dramatically like improved template size and enabled us to also do some runtime, kind of similar to how the JIT works in the browser. We can do runtime analysis as things happen and create optimizations at that level as well. So that's a pretty exciting step.
Right. I just wanted to add that this is very much an iterative process, right? And every time we go through this, we have new ideas, we learn new things. So rinse and repeat is something that's going to happen over and over again. And again, I just want to stress out that the really cool part, I think, from this is that we can do all these changes with absolutely no effect for the user, other than it's just magically faster all of a sudden.
So we've got a question for Ben Lesh from the audience about RxJS. Is there any benefit to observables being part of the actual JavaScript spec? And does TC39 plan on adding any of the RxJS operators natively to JavaScript itself?
Sure. So if there's a proposal right now to add observables to JavaScript natively, and if we were to do that, then well, there'd be benefits around. You could use observables maybe for things like they could add it to the browser for DOM events and things like that. But for RxJS's part, that would mean that we wouldn't have to ship an observable type necessarily. We could just ship extension methods or methods to the browser, and just what you were going to use for things like merge map and whatever. Now, whether or not some of those operators or methods are going to be added to that proposal, I don't think so. And it goes back to I think what Misko was talking about earlier in this screencast or this podcast rather, that you only really want to ship or you only want to include primitives that people actually need. And there'd be a bit of bike shedding about like what do we actually need? And I think array is a good example of this. So array, originally, I think they added like map and filter maybe to array. And now there's other ones like find and find index and these other sum and these other operators or methods that have been added to array. But it's taken years. And frankly, I mean, some of them I still don't use quite that often. So I think it's good that they slowly added those things. And that's why libraries like Lodash exist. And libraries like RxJS will continue to exist even if we ship observables to the browser. So I hope that answers that.
Let me add to it. So the thing you want to add to the platform are things where different libraries have to agree on, right? So if your library uses, one implementation of a string and another library uses another implementation of string, then it makes those two libraries super hard to compose in an application. And so the things you want to add to the platform are just these fundamental things such as strings or promises. And in my opinion, observable should be one of them. But what you want to add is just the concept of a observable, etc., not necessarily every possible method you can think of, right? Like you don't want to add a credit card validator to a string. Like yes, that could be useful in some applications, but not in general case.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So we have a question for Matthew. He says the one thing we got stuck on is initial load time. We adopted bundle loader and now engines, and they feel that bundle loader is more flexible than the official engines. He's wondering if he's the only one who feels that way.
Yeah, I'm not actually familiar with bundle loader. I presume is an add-on for Ember that has an alternative like loading scheme for slab, like lazy slab loading of content, of JavaScript content. I can speak at least to like the benefit. So not being familiar with bundle loader, obviously, I'm going to presume that it's something a little bit more manual where you need to manually opt into what things need to be included in your builds, which certainly gives you a lot more flexibility than engines do. With engines, what we're trying to do in Ember is provide a method of isolation, and then to leverage that isolation, which I think on its own has value. We've worked with teams before where you have a team of 80 people working on an Ember application, and they want to have their own little corner of the app, but you don't actually want to have them each have their own add-ons or something where they had NPM packages, because then you have this dependency hell that's never ending. So you want a way to just isolate part of the application, but not require like a whole new package or anything, and have like a good boundary abstraction in between where your code begins and people who interface with your code begins. And so engines provide that isolation. We can leverage that to, at build time, understand what parts of your application actually need to be delivered down to the browser. So the naive version of this that's supported with engines right now is that you can flag an engine as being lazy. So when you enter a page based on the route or based on what's used in the template, an engine can be lazily brought in. So you go to /foo and /bar. /bar is actually an engine. So that chunk of code only for that engine and all the dependencies for it gets loaded as part of the async in the routing layer of Ember, which is kind of great because we already have async at that level, so it's pretty seamless. The other place is if you're invoking an engine, you can use the mount helper, and that allows for the async at the template layer, which again is a spot where it just naturally fits into the framework. So there's a very natural boundary where you can call mount and pull in an engine lazily. Right now, that all happens asynchronously, and you load the main application, and then you pull these things in at runtime. What we have the ability to do if we enhance the server a little bit more is that we can choose what engines need to be packaged with your JavaScript payloads based on the URL that you enter. So you can imagine that if you visit /foo/bar, the server can understand you're going to /bar, which means you also need to load this engine. And we already have all this code working because we, in Fastboot, we already know how to render that page. So we can actually enter that route and see what engines need to be loaded. We can then create a custom JavaScript bundle that's for that page and then ship that down to the browser. We can either do that dynamically, or you could try and do pre-compilation of all the possible paths. I think pre-compilation of all possible paths is probably not something that works in practice because you're going to have sites that have basically arbitrarily dynamic routes. So you're going to need to do some kind of caching layer. And the caching is going to be a little bit complex because you don't want to cache just by URL. You're going to want to cache by like what your build requires. So that's kind of the plan around like how we can iterate the engine story to improve it, but definitely focusing on, instead of, I've worked in code bases before where you had to manually list the files that you wanted to be in your different bundles. And it was extremely challenging over time. And we probably had more downtime from that one like thing in the code base than from anything else, where someone would forget that the mobile environment, you have to update this list of things to have this other file in it if you add a file to this setup. So we very much prefer the system of creating an abstraction of isolation where we can just do this automatically for you.
Thank you. I had a question for Dan about React Router. So in this.JavaScript, you said that there isn't a preferred way to do routing. React Router obviously seems pretty popular, but do you think there'll ever be a recommended routing library for React?
I don't really see it. I mean, like, we try to keep React focused on one problem, that is creating composable things that you can interact with that render to something. And routing is a little bit different problem. And we try not to open source something we don't use at Facebook. And at Facebook, we have like a legacy existing system that works really well for our use case, like for a giant Facebook app that is integrated with the backend stuff that is Facebook specific and so on. So it doesn't really make sense for us to solve this problem. And this is, I think I'm really excited about the last version of React Router, the V4 beta that came out recently. I think it's a really well-designed API, and we might even start recommending it officially, but it's it's just, we can recognize the de facto status of it being like the most popular library, but we don't want to prescribe it for people who don't like it. Like, there are people who have concerns about it or who have different use cases that are not solved by it and so on. And there are all these alternative libraries that try to solve those use cases better, and I think it's awesome. So I hope that helps.
Cool, thank you. And
I wanted to touch on that a little bit,
yeah.
Just because it presents this. It's sort of an interesting thing that I've noticed. So we tried to do the same approach in Polymer, where we were like, oh, we don't have an official router. We're a library and we're focused on building components. And I think that was actually frustrating for a lot of people that used Polymer, because they were like, yeah, but like, they were like, yeah, and I get that, but like, you got to show me like a way or the way. What's the Polymer way of doing routing, right? And people really, really crave that. And so this isn't, I don't even know if this is like a fully baked question, but I'm kind of curious, like, what people in the audience prefer. Like, I think that on the one hand, I like the idea of being like, hey, we're a library, we're focused on this specific use case. But I also understand how that creates sort of a dilemma for people, where they're like, cool, I'm bought in, I like that use case, but I have this missing, bit of functionality in my app, and I want to do that in a way that sort of dovetails into like your team's vision of how apps fit together. And so is that frustrating for people in the community when we sort of like choose like, hey, we're only this one thing? It seems like inevitably it does become that as the libraries become more popular. People start to say, okay, well, how do I do X the Polymer way or the React way or whatever, So I don't know, I'm curious, or maybe other folks on the panel have an opinion on that, but I've seen that like we went that direction with Polymer initially, and it was actually kind of polarizing.
I have my experience with that personally is that I like having a paved road when it comes to those things. It's not that I can't solve the problem of how do I have my own routing or it's more that if I have an app that I'm building, I'm already solving some important problems right around that app, and I don't want to have to take a break from that to solve some implementation problem of now how do I add routing to this thing. So having like a guided path or a paved road for those sorts of features, so I could more effectively solve the important problems for my company or for my app and actually just build the app, I find to be really, really beneficial. So
yeah, it's a bit of a trade-off. Like, the problem on the other hand is that if you try to implement everything yourself, then you may actually ship a like a worse version than what the community would build. And like everybody, it would fork anyway because people would want to use the better version. But now you have this like split in the community and it's fragmented. I think like the way I try to think about it is that, yeah, it's frustrating if there are like if there is no paved way. I think it's fine. It works well if you have at least one solution that is popular in the ecosystem, that is well maintained, has great documentation and examples. And if you also maybe have some official documentation about the low-level primitives. Like, for example, for routing, you could say that if you want to implement a custom routing system in React, you likely want to listen to browser events and to call set state on the root component. And that's basically how you'd implement routing. And so you have these two solutions. One is like more what most people would do, and the other is how do you build it yourself if you want to. And at this point, I think it's fine to outsource this to the ecosystem.
So Dan, there's a question from the audience about whether using iframes in a React component is considered bad practice.
I mean, if you need an iframe, then put it there. I know there are some browser issues. I think iframes have some like weird behavior, like they reset if you move the DOM nodes or something like this. So in some cases, it's pretty painful. But if you need an iframe, why not? Sure.
Oh, that makes sense. And this is a question from Izzy for everyone. And they're wondering, how do you suggest dealing with JavaScript fatigue? They feel it can be very hard picking what to learn and what to use these days.
Embrace it and learn something new. I'm a big fan of new stuff.
Send an email directly to Sebastian McKenzie about how upset you are that Babel changed. It's the best way to go.
I mean, I can definitely. I think in the Ember community, and I'd be curious if anyone shouts bloody murder in the chat. But we tend to think that we are somewhat separate from this feeling. I like the concept of JavaScript fatigue, that the world is constantly churning under my feet and I cannot find a good testing library or something like that, is just not actually a problem that we have. We have problems for sure, but that's actually not one of them that raises its ire for us. We definitely have ascribed. I think JavaScript fatigue comes from, so Ed Faulkner has this really great blog post that he wrote called Lake Wobegon Web Development, where all the women are strong, all the women are strong, all the men are tall, and all the developers are above average. And I think that is unfortunately what many of the people who build frameworks and libraries are working from that perspective. They are like above average skilled or experience or something like that, not inherent skill, but they have more experience, more background, more resources. Maybe they work at a larger company or something like that. And so we tend to design things that people who operate at that level can use and can leverage really well. And I think when you talk about not bundling something like a routing layer or saying, here's a bunch of tiny libraries for you to compose, you're kind of pitching to yourself. But in fact, the average web developer is someone who's in this 80% bell curve that's somewhere in between the absolute worst web developer like the least skilled, and the most skilled. And that hump is probably below where we are. And I think by trying to target that bell curve, which is what Ember tries to do, it means that we avoid that constant churn that you would get if you're catering to really the people who are above average all the time. I'm sure someone will want to respond.
I'd like to add something to it, which is that I just want to make sure my comments are interpreted correctly. There's a difference between the community as a whole coming up with new tools and features and new ways of doing things, and I think that's great. But the opposite of that is, like, you don't want your framework to be changing underneath your feet all the time, because that puts stress over there. So at Angular, we are really committed hard at making sure that when it comes to new versions of Angular, I know the 1 and 2 was a big step, but from 2 to 4, it should be pretty trivial to upgrade. And going forward, you want to make sure that you're backwards compatible. So when I say embrace the changes, I don't mean necessarily that the framework should change underneath your feet, but rather that all of this churn that's happening is really just innovation. And innovation is a good thing, and people should embrace innovation.
I think at a higher level, some people think of JavaScript fatigue though as not just like sticking with one framework and like as that progresses, getting fatigued with that. It's more like situations where, you know, for example, I get hired at Netflix for my Angular expertise. Then I work on an Ember app, and then I work on a React app. And like even the Ember app, while I was working on it, had a lot of changes that over time that happened very rapidly and you know, caused us to have to rewrite certain things or just give up on upgrading in some cases. Like it's, you know, then there's like, what do you use Webpack? Do you use Browserify? Do you use, and there's all these technologies keep coming out and people struggle like, which one do I learn? What's important? And some people view it as like, well, it's a career choice and that sort of thing. And I personally think that you should research the tools a little, find one that seems to fit the need for your current app, focus on that, but you know, keep your mind open to new ideas. So maybe the next time you choose something slightly different, but you don't have to learn everything in depth, which is I think what people are worried about. Like I have to know everything in order to be employable in this industry, and you don't. You need to know JavaScript really well, and I think having some root fundamental idea of what everybody's framework or build tools or whatever are doing is a good idea. But you know, you don't have to try to be a master of all of it. You just need to be a master of whatever you're using to build your current app, and then but keep an open mind. If you don't have an open mind, you're going to get sunk anyways. Like if you're like, whatever, Ember is the greatest thing in the world and I'll never use anything else. You know, unless you're on the core team, which like, then I would expect you to have that attitude. But you know, if you're just an average Joe and you think that way, then you're probably missing out on something. So keep an open mind, but try to just focus on one thing and don't worry about the entire ecosystem.
There's a really good post by Tessa Thornton. It's called How to Learn Web Frameworks. So I would just recommend anyone struggling with choosing a library or like struggling with JavaScript fatigue to read it.
Yeah, there's also there's a really good talk by Jacob Kaplan-Moss, who's one of the like co-creators of Django, called "I Am a Mediocre Developer," and it's wonderful. It basically talks about kind of like that talent bell curve that Matthew was speaking about, and how a lot of people think it's like, well, you either suck at programming or you're awesome at programming, and there's nothing in between, which is just not the case. And so it's really useful to just become comfortable with the fact that, you know, this is a constant sort of learning experience, and we're all kind of clustered around the middle, and that's okay. And you know, I think it's useful to spend time learning like the core language stuff. Like that's always going to be applicable. And where you have time, like play around with some of the other frameworks just if you have time. And what I found from that is even just doing like, you know, the tutorials and stuff, I've internalized concepts from those other libraries. I'm by no means like an expert in React or Angular or Redux or any of those things, but I've like picked up the concepts, and I sort of, you know, I feel like that helps me think about my own programming style a little bit differently. So, you know, we can find incremental progress, like do it.
You're not going to say just use web components to avoid JavaScript fatigue?
Well, I mean, there's JavaScript in web components, so like it's inevitable, right? Like everyone's gonna run up against it, and I think it totally. I mean, it feels. I sit with all the Chrome DevRel folks, like we're all in one big cube, and so you're surrounded by these people who just, you know, it seems like they're going in a million different directions, and it's really hard to feel like you can measure up to your coworkers sometimes. But again, go check out that talk by Jacob Kaplan-Moss. It's important just to understand that like we're all kind of on like an ongoing learning process journey together, and so it's okay to feel like you're in a learning state, or, you know, something like that.
I don't think you really have JavaScript fatigue until you're typing an email and you find yourself punctuating every sentence with semicolons. That's happened to me. I've done that.
So I just want to throw my 2 cents on the fatigue thing, where I feel like the fatigue usually comes from when you have the feeling that you are obliged to learn something, you're obliged to master something just to keep up. But a lot of times it's like, I feel like when you see something new, like the ideal situation is you don't have to invest all the time to fully master, but you should invest the moderate amount of time to understand what problem it is trying to solve. This way you somewhat like understand, oh, this is the point of this thing. But then you need to understand what problems you actually have at hand. So does this thing address the problem that I'm trying to solve? If it doesn't actually touch upon the things I'm trying to solve, then maybe I don't need to invest, the extra amount of time to master this right here, right now. And I think this goes back to, like having a solid grasp of the core language, and also, I think trying to constantly think about what problems that you actually run into with your current stack. Like if you constantly think about this, you would when something new comes out, you would instantly realize, oh, this actually solves this pain point that I've been having all this time. Then it totally makes sense, and it becomes very natural for you to invest time to look into it. But so basically, all I'm trying to say is, if you have a clear understanding of what problems you actually run into in your work in production, then it becomes much easier to identify the things that you actually should invest time in when new things come out.
I also wanted to add to this. There is a great post by Amjad called "Overcoming Intuition in Programming." I think everyone should read it. It's about how, like, when you're just beginning learning something, it's often hard to get a handle on what exactly is some library or some framework is solving, like what is its positive space, and what is the negative space of everything it is not solving. Because when, for example, when you write like React components, right, you have this kind of, when you understand React well, you kind of do this automatically. You're in the positive space of the library, you understand how to do it. But then you need to understand when exactly you actually need to switch to a more manual mode of programming. You need to realize when React is not going to help you, and you actually need to write some code that is like regular JavaScript. So I remember having problems with this. I would adopt a tool, and I would not be sure what is the positive and what is the negative space of the library, and when I need to actually think. So I think this is something that our community is not very good at. Like we could improve our problem-solving skills. Yeah.
So for those of you who made comments on different articles and different things like that, it would be, folks in the chat are wondering if you can just post the links. That would be awesome. Going back to Evan, your comment about this, just wondering, where would you like Vue to live in the modern web ecosystem, and what are some of the most common use cases for Vue?
So today, I think Vue serves a kind of an interesting role in that so the slogan on the website is called a progressive framework, and the whole idea is we want to be this framework that is approachable, and we want to obviously Vue learns a lot from the other frameworks, like from Angular, from React. We learn a lot from them, but the different thing Vue is doing is we always try to start with the bare minimum and try to progressively introduce these concepts to help the user have a very gentle learning curve walking through all this. But at the same time, like it might be very it might sound greedy, but at the same time, we don't want to compromise on the scalability of being able to handle large-scale apps with Vue when you go into production. And I think a lot of users actually are very happy building large-scale application with Vue. So I think I'd say we've done a decent job on that, and I hope to keep it that way, because in that, we don't want to position Vue as something like you have to be an advanced developer to be able to use it. We want to be this thing where you can grow with the framework. You can use it only for the simple things you want to do. For example, I know a ton of users use Vue as just a straight-up jQuery replacement. They don't change any of the existing workflow on their traditionally server-rendered apps. They just use Vue on the page for really simple enhancements. But when they get familiar with the core concepts, they sometimes, and when they run into single-page application scenarios, they find that, hey, this framework actually can grow to cater to the new use case you're running into. And yeah, I think that's basically the position where we're trying to place ourselves now. And I hope to keep it that way, because I believe it's beneficial to always have this like approachable thing that can just introduce more people into building things on the web.
Great. So we've got a question from the audience about, it's just for everyone, and they're asking, two different people have asked this actually, what framework or library do you guys find interesting, or that you've liked some of the ideas that's not included here? It's not one of the frameworks and libraries here. Does anyone have any?
I know that Most.js, which is very, very similar to RxJS, like I've literally worked with Brian Cavalier on coming up with ideas to make RxJS a lot faster. So I really like that library. It's quite different internally, but you know, there's plans for the future of RxJS to kind of use some of the ideas I learned looking at Most.js with Brian Cavalier, who's the original author of that. So that's one for my part. Not necessarily a framework. It's an observable library.
Oh, come on! Someone else has to like something.
I think the Ember's had a project for a long time called Svelte, which was a project where we wanted to take features that are deprecated in the framework. So today, deprecated features still ship code to the client, and we would kind of inverse feature flag them. So when you're building your app, if you don't have any deprecations firing, then you can opt into a mode where we just like strip out all the deprecated features, which would be like really cool. We called this Svelte mode. Rich Harris has now released a framework called Svelte, which does a totally different thing, where he attempts to like compile the framework into your code at build time entirely and ship no runtime at all. I think it's a little bit of a logical dodge, because in a way, like we all have compilation steps, and we're all, even in Svelte, he's also shipping code to your browser. That's part of the framework. It's just that there is no specific file. He's concatenating everything to one file. So maybe it's not quite as exciting as maybe it looks on the surface, but I think it has some really neat ideas. And the concept just of reminding you, like, what can you lazily compile into the framework, and how much of it can you leave out, is an interesting like mental challenge and thing to think about.
I haven't really watched like JavaScript libraries lately, so I don't have an answer for a library. But I do have an answer for a JavaScript tool, which I hope is also like okay. So one of them is Rollup, obviously. I think Rollup is awesome. I think we'll probably be using it in React to collapse it into a flat bundle. So if you don't know what Rollup is, it's like a bundler that understands ES modules, and so is able to efficiently collapse the whole dependency tree into a single file without all the junk like between modules. So that's one thing. And the other tool I'm super excited about is called Prettier. It's a project by James Longster. It's an automatic code formatter that is not stupid, that is actually like, it's producing readable code. It doesn't ask you to fix any like styling issues yourself. You just run it, and it always prints the code exactly the same way. So it strips out all the original styling, and it code. And I think it's awesome. Like I hate LinkedIn for style rules. So yeah, I'm excited about it.
So one of the things that I'm into, which I saw just the other day, is a project called Elix. Let me see here, E-L-I-X. You can find it at like elix.org. This is something that's like just getting started. It's a web component project by a fellow named Jan, and the reason why I like it is basically an attempt to try and come up with like what are the, if you're building a component that needs to be just as good as like the native HTML components, meaning it like has great keyboard support, it has great accessibility support, things like that, stuff that developers unfortunately oftentimes overlook. Can you create like, in this case, you use mixins, but basically, can you create some sort of like interface that a component would need to comply with? And then if it uses one of these mixins, it essentially gets the right accessibility patterns for free, or the right keyboard support for free. And I guess the reason why I'm really interested in this is because I'm really interested just in accessibility in general. And I'd love to see people producing more accessible components. But I also recognize that the ARIA spec is massive and sprawling and very difficult for folks. It's not something you can just easily like hop into. And so I like the idea of creating like component blueprints in a sense, where it's like, hey, if you're building, you know, a custom radio group, so long as you comply with this particular interface, maybe you have like, you know, certain property setters for managing your currently checked children or something like that. So long as you have some interface that you're complying with, we can go ahead and do the right ARIA on your behalf if you just like include a mixin or something. So I'd love to see more of this in the sort of the component space. Maybe it already exists in the other frameworks out there, but this is just something that I think is really neat.
Tracy, do you want to?
Sure. I think we are just about ready to wrap things up. So I wanted to present one last question is, what are you guys most looking forward to in the web/JavaScript world coming up this year? And that could be the specs or, you know, things that you're seeing form in the community.
So we've seen, we talked about this at like the last episode. So we've seen good progress with folks shipping web component standards. I'd love to see like Mozilla or the Edge team start to land some stuff and ship it. I know that they're like actively working on things, but I'd love to see some of that come out in 2017. And then there's actually there's a lot of really interesting accessibility work going on right now. A few different attributes, CSS selectors, and maybe the idea of like an accessibility object in JavaScript. So every node would have an accessibility object associated with it. So if you've ever done accessibility work, you know that it's a lot of like writing attributes on elements, and that's actually very annoying and kind of, it's just everything has to be done with IDs, and you got to refer to everything with IDs, and it feels not very modern, basically. And so I'm excited to see if we make progress on some of this accessibility object model stuff. I think that would be really cool.
I for one am hoping that this is a year where we can actually start to get even more like I think over the last couple of years there've been more and more cooperation between different frameworks and maybe even between frameworks and people working on the platform. Examples being, you know, Angular using Ember CLI and other things like that. I'm hoping that this year we're going to see more and more of that, and you know, maybe some reduction in some of the rhetoric from some of the polarizing figures in our industry. Just trying to get more cooperation and ship more features out with the platform that frameworks need. Trying to share features between frameworks if we can, that sort of thing. And ideally, that sort of thing would help people's JavaScript fatigue as well, right? To have more unified feature set that different frameworks were able to use.
Fully support that, Ben.
Misko, you're not going to mention zones?
Sure, I can mention zones. Zones are amazing. You should use them. Zones allow you to basically instrument the browser so that you can see what browser is doing with respect to tasks. The cool thing is that you can see when your framework should do stuff, but more importantly, even for testing, you can do magical things like you can intercept scheduling of asynchronous operations, then flush them synchronously, which greatly speeds up your tests and simplifies them. You can assert, for example, that your tests are fully synchronous. There's lots of magical things that zones can do for you.
Matthew, what about you guys?
I think, whoa, text messages. I think the thing that I'm most interested in seeing from the web platform standpoint is actually the mobile payments ecosystem maturing. Apple Pay is a pretty cool spike and works on iOS. It doesn't work if you install to the desktop in iOS right now. And obviously it doesn't work on Android devices. Android's mobile Android Pay works in theory and is documented, but doesn't actually work at all. None of the payment processors will actually process payments that you make with it, which was interesting to find out after having implemented it. So I think that there's still an uncanny valley of that stuff being in place. But if you think about like how people purchase things today and how they interact when they purchase things through computers, I think that that's a huge gap that's missing. The fact that you cannot visit some arbitrary website like Kickstarter and just like tap with your thumb and then have contributed to that thing. And I think that it'll lower the barrier to the point where we have the ability to actually reach impulse buy markets, which is a whole new market for the web. And I think we'll create a lot of new, interesting, encourage people to create new and interesting experiences on the mobile web, which is one of the more exciting parts of the platform. I think in Ember, we, in general this year, we'll see a lot of stuff that's related to being able to scale down the complexity of the framework and work in smaller niches instead of only being super good at doing like large, complex applications. A lot of that is going to be work that goes into the build pipeline, taking roll-up and other like things that have really been experimented and prototyped in this like Webpack world and in the React world and other like lighter frameworks where they get to move a lot quicker with a green field and trying to fold all that stuff back behind Ember CLI's kind of unified front. So that's really exciting. And then I think as a personal thing, the Ember run loop, this is similar to, it solves a similar problem as Zones, but the Ember run loop is like a very kludgy, difficult to teach concept in Ember. It is pretty simple, but I think it has shown that it's like, as much as we might think it's simple, or I might think it's simple, teaching it is actually very hard and people don't get it. And I think that means that the API itself is basically a failure. And with the advent of microtask queues, where promises resolve and things like that, I think we have some other interesting options. So I personally look forward to being able to move away from needing to have a run loop as a concept in Ember and just better leveraging new parts of the platform that we have in IE 10 and up and creating some more simple APIs.
How about Jay? I know you're excited about WebAssembly.
Yeah, my number one is shared array buffer and atomics and WebAssembly, but not because like in the immediate future I'll be able to use it in any important way, but for the long term, it's definitely, they're all long-term bets, but they're primitives that we couldn't do before. They're very fundamental things that we needed.
Very cool. Any other comments, guys?
I was just thinking about the recent progress in ES modules in the browsers, and I was pretty excited that it worked in like Safari preview and stuff. But I think like I played with it, but I think there are still a bunch of issues that need to be ironed out to actually make it like usable for production. But I'm interested to see how this could potentially change the landscape of application bundling and delivery in the long run, because I feel that there's some interesting things that could happen here once the platform gets native capability of just pulling modules from the web. There's also this, I know Google is working on the successor of HTML imports called HTML modules, which is an interesting concept because it actually looks very similar to Vue files, and we're thinking of how we could potentially leverage that as a component delivery mechanism, not only for web components, but for components in all other frameworks. So I think that's something I'm pretty interested in too.
Very cool. So we weren't able to get to all the questions that were presented on the chat and that that were submitted previously, but thank you guys. This was an amazing conversation. It's everything I had ever hoped for, to hear you guys collaborate and talk about something. Oh my gosh, who did that? That was amazing.
I blame Jay.
So next one, I mean, we did talk a lot about browser-related things. So next, This.JavaScript is happening on April 21st. And Adios Money from the Chrome team will be joining us for that. So I'm sure that there will be a lot of questions for him. Please do continue the conversation on Twitter. I'm just going to go down the list of where everybody is. So Ben Lesh, you can follow him at Ben Lesh on Twitter. Evan, you can follow him at Yuxi, YOUYUXI on Twitter. Jay Phelps is _JayPhelps. Dan Abramov is Dan_ABRAMOV. Matthew from the Ember team is at Mixonic, Mixonic. Misko is at Hevery, Hevery. Wow, am I really spelling everybody's stuff out? Last one is going to be Rob. Rob is at Rob_Dodson. And then you can follow me on Twitter at LadyLeet. Feel free to use the hashtag This.JS. And otherwise, we will see you at the next one. So thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jay. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
All right, y'all. Have a great one. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Yeah.